To discuss the recent issues surrounding Indian-Australian relations and the questions of racism and extremism in Australian society, I'm joined tonight in Sydney by TANVEER Ahmed. He's a columnist with the Sydney Morning Herald and also a visiting fellow at the Centre for Independent Studies. And with us from Melbourne is Waleed Ali. He's a politics lecturer at MONASH University and the author of People Like Us. They've both written about race issues for the latest issue of the monthly magazine. Welcome to both of you.
Lee.
Thanks, Lee.
The Indian External Affairs Minister who was here today says he doesn't believe that Australia is a racist country. Waleed Ali, is his domestic audience going to be persuaded by that?
Who knows? I mean, I think the problem that Australia's always had, and I want to stress up front, it's a grotesquely unfair problem, is that Australia's international image and its treatment in international media seems always to have been constructed through the prism of race. We make news internationally when there's some issue to do with race, whether it's Hansonism or it's the apology to the Indigenous or the Cronulla riots or something like that. So what I think that's done is it's meant that in a lot of nations abroad we face this really horrible situation, I think, where the inherent racism of Australia is more or less assumed, and that becomes a very difficult thing to erode, a very difficult perception to shift. It's kind of a stereotype that Australia as a nation suffers from, which I think is unfair. Now, having a minister come out and try to shift that discourse is going to be helpful to Australia, but I think you are dealing with a range of stereotypes that are not necessarily held universally within a given country, but are probably going to be a little bit more stubborn than that, I'm afraid.
TANVEER Ahmed, what do you think about what Waleed Ali's just said?
I guess I'd certainly agree with Waleed in that we have a perception problem regarding racism. I think my impression, especially from many Australians who travel, you get the feeling often people would like to view Australia as rather than viewing them as a sophisticated, diverse nation, they often like to view us as a unsophisticated, slightly backward nation. I remember seeing something where there was a comparison about why Kath and Kim was very popular in New Zealand. And the general upshot was that Kiwis loved seeing Australia in that image because that's how they would have liked to view Australians. So I often get that feeling that part of the reason we make the news is it almost it confirms what many people would like to view of us. But again, I think it's grossly unfair. And with the Indian example, I mean, this is a country, I mean, after they lost the fifth test at the SCG, there were huge cries of racism related to umpiring decisions. So I think it's often a defensive move as well within India, and that, I think, goes for many other ethnic groups as well, where rather than examine the more complex causes of an event, they can be quick to cry racism.
Waleed Ali used the word stereotypes, and sometimes stereotypes do arise because they have some sort of basis in fact. Why, in your experience, do you say that you don't see Australia as a racist country?
I think certainly there's no institutional racism. I think we have a great history of accepting migrants over the recent decades. I think we've been very successful at integrating migrants as compared to other countries of the developing world. And I guess I can speak personally. I mean, having been a doctor, you work at small country towns to Aboriginal communities, and both Waleed and I were educated at fairly elite private schools, which is probably the other end where you may experience discrimination and racism. It's not something I've experienced on any level, to be honest. And my experience of certainly racial issues, it's often been more common within immigrants. And again, the Indian student example probably is a testament to that. If you look at Sydney, where some of the attacks against Indian students were often by Lebanese immigrants here.
I'll pick up on that in a second.
Yeah.
Let me just, before we go into that in a bit more detail, ask Waleed Ali why he thinks this international stereotype has arisen that Australia is a racist country.
It's difficult to say exactly. I mean, I think it has partly to do with our distance from a lot of the major international centres, particularly Europe. And so what occurs, I think, is this idea of a young country that's a bit rough and irreverent. And in some respects, of course, that's true. But even if you look at the popular culture references that seem to define us abroad, they sort of capture that image of something that's unrefined. You know, it's Crocodile Dundee or it's Steve Irwin and so on. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that either of those figures should be considered racist or indeed that they are received that way, but it's part of I guess, a broader pattern of understanding of what Australia is, as something that is a little bit unrefined, a bit non-European. And America, I think, to some extent suffers from a similar sort of stereotyping. That would be a lot worse if it wasn't for the fact that America has so many more tools and resources at its disposal to control its image through cinema, through the fact that it's the most powerful political nation on earth. It can project, its president can project an image of America. It has a lot of the great universities of the world. So there's, I think, a bit of a new world, old world split that goes on here, and Australia is, I guess, on the young, naive, unrefined side of that stereotypical binary.
TANVEER AHMED just said before that he didn't feel that he'd really experienced racism. What about you?
TANVEER obviously never played cricket. I found. I mean, that was the thing. I mean, I was very active in sport when I was young, and you know, even growing up at school. I guess I grew up in an area in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne at the time, sort of through the 80s, where it was a bit odd not to be of an Anglo heritage. There was sort of mostly Anglo-Australian kids, and then me and a few Vietnamese kids, and that was about it. And I've got to say, you know, when I was growing up in that environment, I certainly was keenly aware and was made keenly aware of my difference. And I had to be really, really good at cricket, or really, really good at football to get over that. As long as I was being picked first in the playground, it kind of overcame that. I mean, I wouldn't say that I hadn't experienced racism at all, or indeed, as Tanveer said, that I'd seen more of that in migrant communities. That's not my experience. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not saying it was necessarily high-level racism. I wasn't getting bashed up daily because I looked different. But I think what we tend to have in Australia is kind of a fairly high level of low-level racism, if you understand what I mean. So sort of little day-to-day things, kind of socially discriminatory practices, things like that, that kind of operate almost below the surface and lead to certain inequalities, but they're not major. So when we have an event like Cronulla, it really does shock us because it's, in a way, uncharacteristic of daily life in Australia, which is different, I think, to a lot of other countries where racial tensions are institutionalised and become more of a factor of the general social landscape.
So if what Waleed Ali says is right and there's just sort of a low-level racism, is that anything to be worried about?
I think certainly the broader perception of us as racist is something to be worried about. Now, what strategies we take regarding that are probably multi-pronged, and I'm not sure I'd have all the answers there, but in terms of, I guess, redefining our cultural image abroad, probably many immigrants would be a big part of that, particularly the arts. I think that would play a strong role. Now, I think I'm very interested in the point of